We are living in Starmer land. The Britain of today is what Starmer wants. He is a human rights lawyer. He doesn't want to spend more on the military, really. He likes the kind of international rules-based system which he thought we were living in. I'm Allister Heath, and I'm responding to some of the excellent reader comments on my latest article, Impotent, Useless Britain is the weakest it has been for 500 years. The first question comes from Jonathan Boyd, who says, brilliant article, we also need to slash the size of and simplify the increasingly complicated tax code which adds so much misery to us all. Jonathan, I agree 100% with that, and there are many, many other things that I didn't list in the article that have to happen. But I think ultimately the point of my piece was to say that Britain needs a reset. We need to focus on three big themes. The first is military spending. We need to double military spending over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. We need to hire tens of thousands more military personnel. We need to completely reconstruct our armed forces. We need to embrace robotics and drones and technology. We need to once again be a powerful military power, which is not what we are anymore. We used to be that in the 80s and 90s and maybe even early 2000s, but suddenly it has all gone away because of spending cuts and because of creeping legalism and pacifism. So that's one thing. The second thing is energy policy. We need to deregulate our energy industry. We need to massively increase the production of all kinds of power. We need to scrap net zero immediately. We need to launch a massive nuclear program, and we need to unleash fracking and North Sea oil and solar and wind and anything. We just need to produce more energy because we are in a world where energy matters again and where you need to have the cheapest possible and most plentiful and most secure supplies you can get. And the third point, which relates to your call about tax simplification, is economic growth. We need to focus obsessively almost on economic growth. And what I mean by that really is we need an entrepreneurial revolution. We need new companies. We need to be like America. We need to create new tech giants, new companies. We need a process of creative destruction. We used to have that in this country in the 80s and 90s, but it's kind of dwindled. If you look at the FTSE 100 companies, most of them are quite old. If you go to America, the largest companies are often very recent companies like Nvidia, or of course Apple, or Google, Facebook, all that sort of stuff. SpaceX now increasingly. We need that sort of process in Britain. We need military spending, we need cheap and plentiful energy, and we need economic growth. The next statement or comment comes from Tony Greenfield, who says, I would peg some of this decline to our abandonment of pragmatism. We have lost the ability to do the right thing for the long term, chasing short-term profit over long-term stability on the right and debasing ourselves on the altar of political correctness and the tyranny of the minority on the left. Tony, I agree with that, but I think it's even broader. It's simply that we no longer have the correct priorities. We thought perhaps that we could be a sort of welfarist version of Switzerland. But in reality, we've ended up with poverty, which the Swiss don't have, and a complete lack of influence, which the Swiss do have. In my piece, my main thesis is that our global influence is now at its weakest level for 500 years. And I didn't just make that figure up. I think the last time we were this irrelevant was in the early 1500s. By the late 1500s, we were a power. We were a world power once again, or at least for the first time. The English were defeating the Spanish. We were launching into global and international exploration. The Industrial Revolution then started to emerge in this country, and eventually we became the most powerful country in the world with the highest GDP per capita. We have gone massively backwards, and civilizations die slowly, but our death has suddenly accelerated. We were not looking, we didn't really notice when we reached a tipping point, but that tipping point happened 5, 10, 15 years ago, and suddenly we look at ourselves and we look at our other European competitors like France and Germany, and we realize that European civilization is now largely irrelevant. Never before, or at least not for hundreds and hundreds of years, have the big European countries been this weak, this irrelevant, this tangential. The big powers are now America and China, and you've got rising powers like India and local powers like Israel and so on that are rising all over the world, but we are fading into obscurity as a result of a series of stupid choices we made since the end of the Cold War in 1990. It's a disaster, but we might just about still be able to turn things around if we get our act together. The next statement is from Amanda Mullahs. I agree with everything Allister has written, except doing away with the triple lock. As a pensioner who works enough years to qualify for the maximum state pension with no private pension, billions are spent on illegal immigrants, disadvantaging a generation who worked all their lives to the benefits of those who have contributed nothing and should not even be here is deeply insulting. Well, I'm afraid to say we just do not have enough funds available. We need to slash public spending immediately by probably the biggest amount we've ever been able to cut public spending before. So I'd say 2.5% of GDP immediately, and then probably several percentage points over the next few years. And to do that, there cannot be any sacred cows when it comes to current spending. We need to spend a lot more on the military. We need to spend a lot less on welfare and on current spending. We're going to also have to slash taxes to boost growth, which again means less public spending. So something has to give. And clearly, spending on illegal immigration has to give, I agree. But I can't see how we can retain the triple lock. We need sensible pension provision, of course, but not the triple lock. The next comment comes from Mrs. Wright. My question to Allister, to anyone, is why does Starmer not see what needs to be done? The problem is we are living in Starmer land. The Britain of today is what Starmer wants. He is a human rights lawyer. He doesn't want to spend more on the military, really. He likes the kind of international rules-based system which he thought we were living in. What's happened is that Britain's power and the power of other European countries has faded into insignificance. And as a result, a system which was based on other Western powers being able to occasionally stand up to America, as Britain used to do in the 80s and 90s, for example, no longer exists, which means the whole international legal order has withered away. You need power. There's no substitute for hard power. There's no substitute for hard cash. There's no substitute for having a large military. There's no substitute for having a booming economy. The sort of welfare state Starmer wants, the sort of happy-clappy international legal order which keeps pontificating about human rights and all that sort of stuff, well, that's over. That gamble has failed disastrously. That is a reason why Trump doesn't listen to anything we've got to say. That is a reason why we have no influence on anything anymore in the world, why we have to beg Trump for a bit of money, a bit of resources, a bit of backup over Ukraine. This is a major problem. It's Starmer's model that has failed, even though it's not Starmer himself who largely implemented it. It was the previous Labour government and the previous Conservative government. The next comment is from L.R. Jones. Might I also suggest that bureaucratic and badly administered schemes like gift aid should be scrapped? Yes, I agree that all that small bureaucracy should go away. But I think we shouldn't focus just on small changes that we should make to our society and our economic system. We need to focus on the large ones. And that was the point of my piece. And the biggest change has to be more defence spending. The second biggest change has to be less welfare spending. Then we need to completely tear up energy policy to be much more like the Americans, focus on cheap, plentiful and secure energy, not on climate change targets or anything else. And finally, we need to put economic growth first. We need to wipe away a lot of the barriers to economic growth. We need to encourage risk-taking and business building and business creation and technological innovation. We need to encourage science and technology, not redistribution. The next comment comes from Marcus Adams, who says, we've had literally decades of everything being scaled back, abolished or hollowed out. It's been a tough watch. Jam today and mounting debt. We should have followed Norway's example. Well, I agree the first part of the comment, but not the final part. I don't think the answer is a sovereign wealth fund or something like that. The answer is what I've been saying, which is much less welfare spending, much more defence spending, and a focus on cheap and plentiful and secure energy, and a policy to put economic growth first, to deregulate, to put the private sector first, get entrepreneurs to encourage people to set up businesses here in Britain, to employ people to invent new things, to invent new goods and services, to develop scientific innovations and so on. A sovereign wealth fund is neither here nor there. I don't agree with a lot of what Norway is doing with that sovereign wealth fund. They are politicising it and weaponising it in many ways in an anti-Western way, which actually goes against where I think Europe should go. And in many ways, in fact, Norway's policies are contributing to the West's decline. So I'm not pro the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund here at all. I'm in favour of a domestic revolution in Britain to reboot our country and to make sure that once again we have some influence in the world. The next comment comes from Jeremy Owen. We are a medium-sized island off the coast of continental Europe with a population a fraction the size of the likes of the US, China, India and so on. The small size of our country means we do not possess the resources of these much larger nations. That is true, but doesn't explain why we were much richer, relatively speaking, in terms of GDP per capita compared to other countries, our ranking on that metric, or in terms of military power in the past, in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s, we were able to retake the Falkland Islands from Argentina. We were the second biggest contributor to the Iraq War, whether you like the Iraq War or not. Obviously, it turned out to be a disaster. But the point is, we were able to punch quite strongly above that weight. The fact that we're small doesn't mean very much. You can be small and very powerful. You can be small and very rich. That is what we need to try to do. And probably we don't want to be like the Swiss, just rich and small. We probably want to be rich and influential. But that really is the choice. But that choice can only happen if we start implementing the right policies. The next comment is from Mike Witt. Mike says, how about beating Greenland or Canada to the punch and becoming the 51st state if you can't beat them? No, thank you. I don't want to do that. I think Britain should be an independent, self-governing, sovereign state. We don't need to be part of America, but we could become much more successful and could actually become influential again and could actually stand up to America again if we followed these sorts of policies. America only is interested in its own self-interest, and America only respects strength. They respect hard military and hard cash. That's what they respect. They're not interested in soft power or human rights laws or the United Nations. They're just ignoring all of that. And we need to play that game too if we want to be influential in the 21st century. Falling down the GDP per capita leagues, falling down the military spending leagues, not having any military, not having any soldiers, not having any hard power, being effectively bankrupt, spending all our money on welfare and redistribution, chasing away entrepreneurs and millionaires. That strategy is disastrous, utterly catastrophic. It needs to be reversed immediately. As always, thank you to all our subscribers for your comments. Please keep them coming, and we will try and get back to as many of you as possible.